Well, thank you all so much for coming bright and early on this morning. I'm here to talk about sprinting up the pyramid of pain. Just by way of introduction, I do cyber threat intelligence consulting and sometimes analysis for Deloitte. I'm based out of DC. Before Deloitte, I was a government contractor at the Department of State, so happy to talk about either of those after that. Additionally, I work for a large company with a lot of lawyers, and they would like you all to know that everything in this presentation is mine and has no particular relationship to Deloitte clients. And if you want the full legalese, I'm happy to share that with you. So I wanted to start off by defining the problem. We're all pretty familiar with the pyramid of pain. We know, don't focus just on indicators, focus on behaviors. And while I think many of us are from organizations that are pretty mature, have a pretty good handle on defining hunting for behaviors, there are a lot of organizations, at least the ones I've worked with, that are really struggling to climb up the pyramid. And remember, as David Bianco said, the pyramid isn't just painful for the adversaries, it's painful for the defenders. It's hard when you're at a low maturity organization, you don't have all the people, the technology to start hunting for all the TTPs in the world, right? But they know that simply just churning through, applying, triaging indicators is insufficient for cyber defense. It never really was. The analogy I like is skating where the puck was, right? We know what happened in the past, but those indicators are exceptionally brittle and are really not terribly useful by and large. So these organizations know they need to focus on behavior. They understand, they know they need to be higher on the pyramid of pain. But which ones? How do you start when you have a very small team, limited resources, and your board is saying, attack, pyramid of pain, we need to hunt for behaviors. So I am nothing if not biased, and as a threat intelligence professional, I think everything in cybersecurity should be driven by and centered around intelligence. And this should be no exception for content creation, hunting, and detections. But this concept is not necessarily universally adopted, especially at low maturity organizations where they've thought of intel as only give me the indicators and I'll block them. They don't think of intel as really leading operations to a higher state of maturity. So intel needs to work with operations to continuously collaborate to create content. Again, some of us are probably familiar with this, but a lot of organizations, they're often siloed. They don't realize how the value that intel can bring. So the outcome of this is intel focusing your very limited ops resources, people, technology, to focus on the most relevant behaviors, things that are deemed the most critical threats to an organization. So one way of doing this, a framework for thinking about this, is sprints, which I think a lot of people are familiar with from the DevOps world. A really good definition I like is a period of time during which work has to be completed and made ready for review. In programming, this is often 2 weeks. In the world of cybersecurity, I would think 3 to 5 business days is feasible for even lower maturity organizations. More mature organizations are probably doing this at an even faster scale. But when you're just starting out, don't bite off more than you can chew. Excuse me. There are a couple of important characteristics I want to point out. All of this needs to be driven by threat intelligence. It needs to reflect the priority intelligence requirements. Intel needs to define what is critical to the business, collect, analyze, and report on behaviors that pertain to threats that are most critical to the business. If you're just reporting for reporting's sake, this is a waste of time. Second, this needs to be scoped narrowly to focus on what is feasible. What can an organization achieve now? Not what can we do 3, 6, 9 months from now. That's important to do from a strategic perspective, but what can we do with the tech stack we have now, with the people we have right now? And then finally, there needs to be continuous feedback. Again, many of you are from large organizations where Intel and Ops are sitting together, working together, but that's not necessarily happening at a lot of smaller, less mature organizations. So continuous feedback can help drive process improvements. And as a consultant, I'm all about process improvement. So the outcome of using these sprints is rapid development, testing, provisioning of detector controls, as well as hunting, aligned again to the most critical threats, and ultimately stronger working relationships between your ops people and your intel people. So one way to think about this, I provided an example of a few select items from DN espionage. This is Cisco Talos' report from last year. Obviously, there's been some updates since then. And this is not comprehensive. This is just a few select items. Obviously, we can categorize artifacts and behavior into both host-based and network-based. So we've got a consistent file path. We've got a scheduled task with this interesting name. We've got this consistent registry key, some process-level behavior. What do we do with this? Of course, write content for EDR or your SIM, looking for our artifacts and process-level behavior. This spawns this. These are the commands, so on and so forth. Same thing with network-based artifacts. There are some consistent network artifacts in terms of how the URLs were formatted in the C2 requests. And of course, the whole point of DNS espionage, there was some DNS tunneling. So you have this DNS beaconing. And then, of course, you use your IDS or your SIM to write rules for artifacts and behavior. So an example workflow. What does this look like? So we start off, as with all things in life, with requirements. Intel drafts the initial report saying, hey, this is DNS espionage. These are the behaviors that we think you guys can focus on, and presents it to ops. Then you have planning and scoping. You say, okay, what is feasible for us to look for now, right? Then you have development. I've included some very, very simple examples of looking for artifacts. Obviously, higher on the pyramid of pain, tools and TTPs require more time, but this is just simple. Look for this process path, and oh, by the way, here's a regex for the C2 URI. Then you have testing. Hey, is this not working? Are we getting a whole bunch of false positives or whatever? That helps call out things to focus again. What is most useful? What can we action on now? And then finally, not only do you have feedback between Intel and ops during the sprints, you have feedback across as well to drive, as I mentioned, process improvement so that you're getting to a more mature state of the organization where everyone's better able to both report on and action on malicious behaviors. So as I mentioned, I like process improvement, so we're going to talk about that for a bit. Requirements. Intel needs to keep understanding how ops works. How do we change our reporting to better align to their capabilities and their needs, the data sources they have, what they're interested in, right? And then ultimately, ops needs to learn how to ask meaningful questions of intelligence. Hey, we're working on this problem. Can you guys supply us something to address this information need? It really should be a back and forth. Planning, who needs to be involved in our sprints? Can we do this faster? Does the format cadence need to be changed, et cetera? For development, when you're just starting off, you have to build a lot of things from scratch, but as we all know, once you've got things, you don't need to reinvent the wheel. If you can define leading best practices, especially for new analysts as they're onboarded, hey, this is the way to write good content, these are templates you can use, that makes things a lot faster. Testing QA, you're going to identify efficiencies, ways to more easily triage and get rid of things that are generating too much noise and to refine them. And then, of course, feedback to continuously drive process improvement. One question that maybe in a lot of your minds is, well, how do we use attack with this? And I think attack is very good because it's a taxonomy, right? It allows Intel and ops and everyone to speak the same language and categorize behaviors. So it provided an example of how Intel could provide some reporting using the attack framework. This is based on reporting by Emanuele De Lucia last year. There are a couple APT28 malware variants. And again, this is only some select phases from attack. This isn't the full chain just because of screen space and time. So execution is the tactic. Techniques, we label things with the MITRE UIDs, and then procedure is one level more granular. We've got these EXEs doing these things. Persistence, we have these artifacts that are written to disk that you can look for. Defense evasion, you're cleaning up to hide your tracks as well as modifying some keys. And then, of course, there's this anomalous C2 traffic. And what's useful for this is not only categorizing things so you're speaking the same language within a sprint if we're developing a particular piece of content. It's also useful more strategically so that when stakeholders go to Intel and say, okay, can you tell us how this APT works? What are the main behaviors we should be worried about? Then Intel should hopefully have a corpus of data where they can say, oh, yes, this is how they work. These are the main tactics that they use organized by MITRE to either drive adversary threat emulation or content creation or whatever. So it's, again, not just useful in the short term, but also useful long term. There was a great talk at AttackCon in 2018 that talks more about this and kind of blew my mind. So in conclusion, creating content consumes valuable time, especially in lower maturity organizations where they aren't necessarily as familiar with what are behaviors, how do I start looking for this? And they have limited time and, in many cases, very limited resources. So how do we deal with this? How do we spend our resources appropriately? We use brief sprints where Intel and Ops work together to build content, again, aligned to the most critical threats and to provision it in a timely fashion. By using these sprints, again, you're focused on what's relevant. Intel and Ops should be interacting. The reporting should be relevant to what the organization needs, and you should be rapidly developing, tuning, and provisioning, because after a certain period of time, your intel is no longer useful. The adversaries have moved on. Critically, success requires you to have a robust threat intelligence program. As with all things in life, you can't just say, oh, well, go do this. Intel drives sprints. You need to have a strong intelligence program. You need to have meaningful priority intelligence requirements that address your business requirements. You need to be able to collect against these. You need to be able to analyze and report on behaviors of threats that align to those PIRs, and to share that in an effective manner with your ops customers. And this goes for vendors too, right? Vendors need to understand what, I'm providing threat intelligence, what are the main things that my customer is interested in? Because if you're just reporting for reporting's sake, again, it doesn't matter. So in conclusion, how do we climb up the pyramid of pain with sprints, where Intel and Ops work together in joint sprints to create content, again, aligned to malicious behavior that is most relevant to an organization. So this concludes what I have prepared. I'm happy to address any questions you may have at this time, or at eloui@deloitte.com. Don't go at once. Yes?
How do you avoid tuning your intel team to verified RFA?
Just give it, you mean like, just give me all the stuff, I don't need to know the context?
No, I mean, oftentimes it might just be a forward, hey, I read this on the phone.
Yeah.
Like, where do you really get that value out from the intel team with regards to prioritize?
Sure. Well, Intel needs to work with business level stakeholders to understand what is the mission, what is critical to the success of this organization. We've got people here from manufacturing where it's about keeping your assembly lines up. We've got other people with very critical IP. In my own organization, Deloitte, we don't have critical IP, like our methodologies are not that interesting, but it's the client data, right? So you need to start by understanding how the business works, people, process, technology, and then from that you decompose that into your PIRs to drive your collection. But yeah, Intel also needs to be an advocate for itself to explain this is what our mission is, this is what we're going to do. We're not necessarily going to be all things to all people. Yeah, Alan.
So, I don't know if that was Justin, but I'm very blunt. I have real trouble with this approach.
Uh-huh.
Not that we are not practicing this, we are a big organization, but all that you talked about, when you can, to minimize the value of actionable intelligence. Let's talk about Nathan Power, right? All these things that Justin and Nathan focus on, and I try to also. What's actionable in all of this? Well, I saw in all this a set of regexes. Those regexes just characterize, it's just a pattern matching work domain.
Mm-hmm.
We've been doing that forever. So in a defense in-depth program, we are practicing a lot of most of these things. And so to minimize, because some of these indicators that these move at fast rate,
Mm-hmm.
I agree, they move. But if you move at scale, you can keep up with it. So I'm the antithesis. I really don't buy it all the way.
Okay.
That's why I'm not involved with the attack work going on in my organization.
Sure.
I observe it from a distance, but if you can move at the rate the bad guy does and at the scale, it's minimization of indicators, I don't buy it personally.
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say that you should be minimizing or ignoring indicators. I guess from my perspective, you want to be automating it as much as you can to free up people to focus on higher levels. So yeah, I don't want to completely dismiss that. But it's also true that a lot of organizations might not have that level of maturity as well. So, but yeah, don't necessarily discard all of them. Just realize that it alone isn't going to solve all your problems, but it can reduce the noise level, and that's a really good, important point. Yes?
How often do you encourage this
Mhm.
inundated with their normal work. How often does it get together for a short period of time and then there's the rising value of getting the most of the time out of it without taking anything from
Well, I guess to an extent you do need a commitment from leadership that, you know, they're willing to invest resources, right? If you're just giving people more unfunded mandates, you know, and oh, do this in addition, it may be harder to achieve. But I mean, you want to have daily stand-ups to say, hey, where are we on this? And, you know, if you can do it within 24, 48 hours, so much the better. But in some organizations, it feels like it's a little more dragging people by the teeth. So yeah, you want to have the daily check-ins, but more importantly, you do need the leadership buy-in.
Questions from the audience? We actually have a little bit more time. If not, I'll ask a question.
Yeah.
How long have you been practicing this? You know, how long has this been, you know, from when you started it? I'm sure it went through several iterations. As you presented it today, how long have you been practicing this?
Sure, so this is fairly recent. This is 6-9 months, right? So there may be, and honestly, if there are better approaches, I am all ears to learn, like, you know, is this valid? Does this scale over other organizations?
And in that time period, you know, in that 6 to 9 months,
Mm-hmm.
what are the outcomes that you've noticed that prove to you that this is the right approach?
Well, I think first you've got the stronger relationships, right? Where people not only are they thinking in terms of behaviors, but they're understanding these are the questions that we can ask from Intel. This is what Intel is going to be providing, so they have a better expectation, and so that they're better able to, they have a better understanding of their data sources. So it really starts from the relationships and the working together.
Okay. Any last questions? Oh.
These are like five people on Intel. I mean, ops is bigger, but in terms of people doing actual, you know, content creation, 2 or 3, you know. It may not be appropriate for much larger, more mature organizations. Rarely. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I suppose you kind of need both Intel and Ops, right? With Ops, they've got to have their collection of the various logs and data sources, network and host space, aggregating that into a SIM and all of that. But from an Intel standpoint, you need, again, as I mentioned, you need to have a robust program. You need to have those priority requirements, which again, I know it's being a horse, but you've got to be aligned to what is relevant to the business. And then you have to have collection of information on threats that are relevant to the business. And then Intel needs to be able to analyze and report on that. So yeah, it starts with having a fairly functional Intel team, but obviously Ops needs to be able to action on it, right? If you don't have any collection or any visibility to action on it, you need to focus your resources there. Mm-hmm. You mean from a artifacts and behaviors standpoint, or in terms of how do we collect the information? Yeah. Well, obviously you've got the priority from the business, but you do also need to understand your customer, right? Intel needs to have a deep appreciation of what log files do I have? What can Ops actually action on, right? Because if they're supplying things about data points that might be nice in some organizations, but Ops doesn't even have the collection due to whatever technological or process limitations, it doesn't matter. So yeah, you have to understand what are they going to do? What can they use?
All right. Thank you very much. Great
Thank you very
talk.
much.